It was June when we knew for sure. There it was in the Sun headline, Cornell Crew to go to England. A lot was happening that week, and the prospect of the trip to Henley made it that much more exciting. It was the week when John Collier dedicated our new boathouse, and the last week of practice until the IRA regatta at Syracuse. That boathouse was going to be a honey. It had room for all the shells we had, with racks to spare. It had a dorm for the visiting crews to sleep in, and best of all, lots of hot water so the varsity wouldn't have a cold shower whenever they were the last ones to come in after practice. Mr. Collier seemed to be having a grand time at the dedication. All of us on the crew were amazed to find that Mr. Collier had just come in from a workout. He must have been tired, but Mr. Collier didn't show it a bit when he troweled the first dab of mortar onto the cornerstone. When the cornerstone laying was finished, we put on our rowing uniforms to give the alumni a show of what we hoped to do at the IRA the next week. We launched the shells and rowed by the docks a few times, but when that was done, we had work to do. We needed one more time trial before the IRA to see how we were doing. So we changed into our everyday practice uniforms and rowed slowly down the inlet out to the lake. Coach Sanford headed us toward the start of the 3-mile course, where we would have a dress rehearsal of Saturday's race. Our coxswain, Carl Schwarz, got us lined up, and Coach gave the signal to start. We did it just like we were going to do it on Lake Onondaga. We started high and settled down to a smooth, steady beat that would carry us through the 3 miles with nothing left over at the end. All of us were seniors, and we knew from 4 years of experience under Coach Sanford that it took precise timing as well as endurance for us to be victorious. And that's just how we did it. As the crews came in sight of the finish line at the IRA, Cornell had a decisive lead and was pulling away smoothly from the second-place Penn crew. Penn was a surprising challenge in both junior varsity and varsity races. In fact, their JVs were only inches behind Cornell's when they lost a man overboard in a freak accident. But with only 7 men rowing, Penn was still able to finish third in their race. The varsity race was in the bag for us, though, and it capped one of the greatest seasons in Cornell history. Not only had the varsity gone undefeated, but the Big Red JVs had followed in their footsteps with no defeats in any of their races. There were smiles of victory all around as Coach Sanford accepted the trophies on behalf of his 2 championship crews. We had our trophies too. Following the old crew tradition, we collected the shirts of the crews we had beaten, right off their backs in most cases. Sure, they were dirty, but we didn't care. We were going on to the biggest race in our rowing career, the Henley Royal Regatta. The shell and equipment were loaded on the cargo plane and were well on their way to England when we boarded our plane the next day. We all wore blue blazers with a Cornell crest as a uniform, and that same sign was there that always seems to pop up wherever we go. It wasn't long until the plane was moving down the runway, and we were on our way to England. A beautiful day greeted us in London when our plane landed. We were glad to get out and stretch our cramped legs. Our first job was to load the shell on the truck that would take it to the inn where we stayed. The English called the truck a lorry and scared the daylights out of us by driving on the left side of the road. But after a while we became used to the differences and set our minds to rowing. Although the races are held at Henley, we stayed up the river a couple of miles in a little town called Ship Lake. This way we could have the river almost to ourselves while we practiced in the few days remaining before the first races of the Henley Regatta. There was just enough room at that little dock to launch our shell, and even then it had to be guided in and out with a long pole. But the River Thames was a beautiful place to row. The water was always calm, and there was no one to interrupt us as we practiced. Our inn was named the Baskerville Arms, and they had a motor launch called the Hound, which they loaned to Coach. But the Hound wasn't as good in chasing things as its namesake, because our shell could always leave it far behind. So Coach would shout instructions to us as we went by. The Baskerville Arms was a wonderful place, but they were short on one thing: bathtubs. So we did the best we could with what we had, and it turned out fine. Some of the neighbors wondered what we were up to, but it was one way to get clean. It wasn't long until the drawing was held to determine the order of the races. All of us went into Henley that morning to see who we would race on the first day of elimination heats. On the way to the town hall, we saw some of the sights of Henley. The whole town was helping with the regatta, even the bobbies. The race was 118 years old, and it cost $30,000 to set up all the tents by the river and to prepare the course. The town itself was over 800 years old, and the drawings were to be held in the town hall, which dated from the very beginning of Henley. Inside the hall, we didn't see a sign of either Russia or Yale, but we knew they were going to be in the draw too, along with the 3 English crews, London, Thames, and Queen's. We were lucky in that first draw. From the Grand Challenge Cup itself, we drew a bye, which meant that we didn't have to race in the first round of elimination matches. Russia was to meet Thames, Yale would race London, and Queen's drew the other bye. We didn't expect that Russia and Yale would have too much trouble. The English crews were good, but they don't have the same sort of crew competition as we do in America. The first day of the elimination matches was the 4th of July, and the English celebrated it with a dismal drizzle. Among the spectators was Clifford Goes of Syracuse, who was head of the American Olympic Rowing Committee, and Fred Guterman, an old Cornell coxswain who seems to be at every race, no matter where it is. The English children were quite friendly too. They thought we were some kind of national heroes and were always asking for autographs. It was then that we got our first glimpse of our toughest competition. It was a club called Krasnoznamia from Leningrad. We could tell them by their bright red shirts and the odd blue sweatsuits that they seemed to wear constantly. But no matter how strange they looked, we knew that they were a good crew. Everything was different about those boys, except the feeling of friendliness and sportsmanship that they showed us. We took a time trial to get used to the course. It was shorter than any course on Cayuga. It was lined with log booms on either side and was as straight as a bowling alley. The river was so narrow in spots that only 2 crews could race at the same time. The shell started from gates, much like the start of a horse race. The course wasn't wide enough for a power boat and a crew at the same time, settle after their cruise, including Coach Sanford. Close behind him were 3 spies, 2 Englishmen and 1 Russian. They wanted to know our time nearly as much as we did, and came within a second of finding our exact time in that trial. As we approached the finish line in front of the empty stands, the crew was looking good. But somehow it wasn't the same crew that won the IRA. Something was wrong, but what? We didn't have that feeling of complete exhaustion that comes after a well-rowed race. We took the shell in and walked over to the next tent to talk things over. We didn't know the exact time, but we could tell by the look on Coach's face that something was off in that time trial. Our trainer, George Quant, who all the crewmen know as Uncle George, had the usual oranges for us, but they didn't make us feel any better. Carl knew that something was wrong. The coxswain always does, but we couldn't put our finger on it. In the meantime, the Russians weren't wasting a minute. They were on their way out to their elimination race. They were going to show us just what kind of a crew they were. The starter gave them the signal, and the shells were off. The starters' boats were the only ones on that river fast enough to keep up with the shells, but they were incredibly long. The structures by the side of the log boom were course markers that showed the crowd at the finish line who was ahead. Although they couldn't see the crews in the water from the finish line, they could see the number at the top of the sign, which indicated the lane in which the winning crew was rowing. Russia was ahead of Thames all the way. They rowed a rather odd stroke that American crews find tiring. They lift the oar high above the water before they slam it in. It's a fast stroke, fast on the start, and a crew that rows that way is likely to get ahead in the first quarter mile. But it's a tough stroke to keep up for a long distance. When Yale came by in their race against London, they were rowing in the usual American style. It's the style that we row, long and smooth, with the power on all the way through. It seems slower than the Russian style, but it's better in a long race because the crew doesn't tire as fast. It was still drizzling as the crews approached the finish line. And at that same time, we were about to row out for our last practice before our match with Russia. We went up the river, away from the racing, to get the last bit of polish that might make all the difference. We took practice starts, lots of them. We had 3 sparrows at Henley, Jack Meekum, Glenn Light, and George Bullwinkle. Even though they weren't actually in the racing boat, they were practicing just the same, because anything happened to one of the men in the racing boat, a spare had to take his place. On race day, while Coach pasted on the number, Jack got out the can of wax. The sleeker the shell was, the faster it was going to cut through the water. The band in the steward's enclosure was playing marches as the dozens of preliminary races were run off, and soon it was time for us to get ready. Russia put their shell in the water and paddled easily away from the dock. We pulled our shell out of tent number 6. And Carl guided it by the bow through the crowd out toward the water. While our manager made sure the riggers were right, we went back up to the tent to get our oars. Coach gave everybody a few last words, as if they were necessary. Every man knew what he had to do. We knew that the Russians might have a chance to get ahead at the start because of that fast, choppy stroke they row. But our big chance was in the middle. As soon as the shells were in the starting gates, the starter raised his flag, and we were off. Russia did get off to a fast start, and the crowd at the finish line could hear it over the loudspeakers. Russia had a quarter of a length in the start and was opening it to half a length in the middle. And coming down with half a mile to go, the lane signal went up. Russia was still ahead, but now by only a few feet. Both crews were ready to sprint, and we were still closing in on the Russians. Russia was tiring fast. They kept a high stroke, always two above us, but with a quarter to go they couldn't hold it, and the lane marker showed that it was Cornell ahead by half a length, and then 3/4, and stroke Phil Gravink took the beat up in that famous Cornell sprint. The stroke was up to 42, and Russia was lost a full length behind as we swung past the finish line. The time was 6 minutes and 30 seconds, 8 full seconds faster than the previous Henley course record. But before we knew it, it was the next day, the day of the final race. Yale had beaten Queens the day before to qualify for the finals, so we had our work cut out for us. Everyone was out to see it. Schoolboys were everywhere, and college men were decked out in their school colors. But once again, we had a job to do. Putting the shell in the water was almost second nature by now, but when Phil sat down in the stroke seat, he and the rest of us meant business. Carl grabbed hold of the tiller ropes, got a firm grip on the rudder, and we shoved off. Even Uncle George wasn't sure. We had beaten Yale twice that season, but one win had only been by inches. The race was soon to begin. The shells were painstakingly backed into the starting stalls until the bows were even. Then the referee asked if we were ready. Yale was, and we were. And we were off, and the crowd at the finish hushed to hear who was ahead. Yale was off to a fast start, but not fast enough to catch the Cornell shell. We were moving on them slowly, rowing the same style of race, almost stroke for stroke with them. But we knew that this race wasn't going to be won at the start. It would again be in the middle that the winning crew would assert itself. And that crew did assert itself. As we came down the course toward the crowded stands, we were still moving on Yale, and the markers showed the crowd who was in front. In the final race between two American crews 3,000 miles from home, it was the red-tipped oars of Cornell that led all the way. It was almost an even match, but the Big Red had the extra reach, the extra power, to pull out inch by inch over the Elis until half a length separated the crews. Yale was not going to give up easily. They sprinted hard, but they couldn't make up for what they had lost during the body of the race. It was still Cornell as they crossed the finish line. Carl splashed his hands in the water and threw a spray over the rest of us. We won. The race was over, and the cup was ours. We had the shell in the boat tent in no time. And we grabbed Carl by the ankles and wrists and hauled him out on the dock. All season long, we had waited for this moment, and we were going to give it to him. The race was over, and we had won. We all gathered in the tent to celebrate. Everyone was there. Uncle George, Coach Sanford, Sean Van Horn. Everybody was grinning, and everybody was happy. Todd Simpson took off to send a cable to his wife at home. Bill Schumacher was giving the story to reporters. Dave Davis was signing dozens of autographs. Phil Gravink was eating every orange in sight. And even Uncle George broke training. A few hours later, it was time to present the cups, and all the stewards and officials of the Henley Regatta were gathered up at the presentation platform. It had begun to rain, but nothing was going to dampen our spirits. Our eyes were on that big cup. Our Commodore, Clayton Chapman, got the bowl of the cup, while Carl got the base. And each one of us received a victory medal. Last came John Van Horn, our bowman, who received the Book of Honor, containing the names of every Grand Challenge winner in history. It was time to say goodbye to the inn at Chip Lake and to pack our bags, ready to head for many destinations. Many of us stayed in Europe to tour, while some went home to America. But one thing was sure. All of us went away with a feeling that we had just participated in the greatest event in our lives, and one which none of us would ever forget.